pressure that put on people. Nobody really sort of gets into that, the everyday pressures that put people into competition with each other for supplies, for food, for some sugar or things like this, medical supplies. And one of the things that was so frightening to a lot of parents, and including myself as a kid, was diphtheria. And Dr. Lewis was our family doctor, as well as a family friend, close family friend. And, you know, there was great fear that we might get diphtheria, because eventually my parents would never say diphtheria. You know, if it was so-and-so's, oh, was it dip? In order not to frighten us. So there were these terrible pressures on this community. And and in actual fact, the government, which my grandfather was a part of, did very, very well. And in actual fact, the Germans couldn't get along without them. At first, you know, the Germans wanted to get everybody off the island and turn it into a fortress. But that was unpractical. And then their next problem was labor. So they had to import slave labor. And then there was a labor force where people worked for the Germans, and they would get people to work for a little more money, and some people did it because it offered opportunities to steal and that sort of thing, get a little extra here and there. And you couldn't just go slow if you worked for the Germans, you see. So there was this constant pressure that adults went through. But as kids, it was different. We didn't have toys. You had live ammunition. You went down to the golf course after the maneuvers, and you picked up all the rounds that they dropped. And then you traded, and we had a whole business going on at school, you know. And I got severely paddled by Miss Painter for taking live ammunition to school. And because her brother and her father both died in concentration camps, and they'd been sent away because they'd been caught with an old gun and some ammunition. And later, there was a time when the Gestapo knocked on the door, and I was home with my parents, with my mother, and Herr Wolf arrived, and with a jerry guard, and they searched the whole house for a radio, and I knew where the radio was. My mother knew where the radio was, and I knew she was scared, you know. And it was my father had hidden it in a hat, and it was hanging on the peg in the cloakroom. What he didn't do, that he didn't tell us, was that very morning he took it to the factory to have it repaired. And so when he got home, my mother all but killed him, you know. I mean, because it was, you know, it was serious, and I knew what could happen. And then, you know, I'm thinking about Miss Painter's brother and her father, and what might happen to me, even though I'm only 8 years old. But you're conscious of these things. And while Fritz the guard up the road is nice and friendly, and, you know, he would open his rifle up, show us how to put the rounds in, close it up, and things like that, you always realized they were the enemy. And I think one of the wonderful things that our parents did was keep those values going. We're going to win the war, and there's a line you don't cross. They're the enemy.
What did they do for food?
Food, well, I mean, food was the big problem all the way through the war. They had, everything was rationed, and this is where the government was good. They ran this in a sense, for the Germans. And because the Germans, otherwise they would have had to have a lot of manpower into producing food. There were no gardens. All the gardens were dug up, you planted. But by the end of 44, there was no seed left. We were out of seed. Christmas of 44 was about the time when everything was going to run out. And things were getting very, very serious then. And January of 45 was the coldest winter. All the kids we all had chilblains and everything like that. And it was wicked. And there was very little fuel. And you couldn't just go cut firewood and things like that. And the Germans, appropriated everything. We had farmlands, but half the potatoes and everything like that, they'd come and take. The milk, everything was, picked up. And a German would come along and supervise and take things. So it was food, it was supplies, everything. You hid what you can. My father had a ton of sugar at the factory all the way through the war. And it belonged to the factory. It had been there as part of supplies before the war. And he left it there. It was legal because it was there before the war, so it had nothing to do with hoarding or anything like that. But the reason he didn't give it to the hospital or put it out was because it would have been on the black market right away, and it would have gone out for £1 a pound, which was like £100 a pound today. And so they just covered it up and left it there through the whole war. And then he produced all the sugar beet syrup that people used as, put it on their porridge and things like that. And that's what they did. Germans wanted him to can meat, and he wouldn't do it. And besides, all the canning equipment was Continental can, and they couldn't get the cans to fit. And he wouldn't have done it anyway. But there was one thing I've never forgotten. Certain things as a kid you never forget. I went down to the factory one day after school, and there was this barrel. And in this barrel was about half full. And it looked like lard, yellow lard. And the Germans had brought it down. And it had the worst smell you could even... And they wanted my dad to make soap. You just have to use your imagination a little bit to understand where that fat came from. Even the workers in the factory. I remember 2 girls that were there. They knew where it came from. And that's frightening.
Who benefited from the black market? Who were the...
Well, there were some people that hoarded. I remember they caught one guy. He had so much, he had more than a store would have, a supermarket would have, and it was all put on show in a window on King Street, and everybody would stop and wind it. So there were some people that would hoard, but everything, there were all kinds of little things on the black market. And the big word, and the big thing, if you really wanted to convince somebody, it's pre-war. I got a pair of pre-war this, pre-war that. Yeah, it's pre-war. Guarantee it's pre-war. So, yeah, the black market was thriving, and that's the way it is. So, as things become difficult, and this is what you realize when you. I look at today, I look at Europe, I look at the world, and I realize that everybody is going to have to work a lot longer for a lot harder, and a lot harder for a lot less, the way we're going. And when that happens, things change and people change. And you never forget that. You just never forget that. Recycling, people have no idea what recycling is today. Recycling is taking your jacket, turning it inside out and retailoring it the other way, unweaving the old sweater to make 2 pairs of socks. Everything was saved, everything. Yeah, I remember my mother was furious one day. She was walking in the park and she saw a girl that had worked for us as a maid and had taken some curtains from the house and had a whole outfit made out of them. And I remember she said, there's my curtains going down. So people, you know, the human nature is human nature, and so there's the funny. You have to laugh at the situation, but as I say, there's that line. There were the Germans. You got along with them. You learnt to live with them. You ignored them. And again, from a child's point of view, and as kids, they were soldiers. We were interested in guns and badges and whatever you could get and swap and things like that. But you know, the line was there, and it was drawn very, very clearly for me. And one morning in Samaray Lane, at where the old post office and station was. And Samaray Lane back then, for people living there now, was just a gravel lane full of potholes. And at the cross, there was a level crossing, a railroad, where the railway crossed the lane. And there were a group of Russian workers working there, you know. And I was just watching them and everything like that. And then there was one guy, he sort of smiled at me. It was my sort of big guy with a square jaw, and he wasn't German, you know. And the lunch wagon came with this big thing of soup for them, and they sort of broke off and they sat down, and I sat next to him. And he offered me some of his soup and beans, you know. And we tried to talk a little bit, because there was a language barrier, of course. And there was another guy there. I've never forgotten him, because they were working hard. They had no clothes. There was one guy who had no shoes. And he had dipped his feet in tar and stuck gravel on the soles of his feet. And that's how he had to work. And yet he still had a smile. He could still find something to laugh about. And I've just never, I mean, it gets to me. It gets to me. And you get angry. You get angry today when I see the same kind of people now taking over.
The Russians were everywhere, weren't they?
Russian prisoners, yeah. And they tried to get out at night and try and scrump for something, you know, and some people helped them and tried to give them. And I remember when it was so cold in that January of 45, my father was saying to me, think of the Russians, okay? They don't have any fire, they don't have clothes, you know. So you're lucky, and we'll survive.
What happened to the German troops during this time?
Well, I mean, they were just as hungry, and they were so glad when the war was over. There was still the arrogant Nazis around, but the average soldier like Fritz, you know, who I used to pass every day on the way to school, you know, and he used to have this little dictionary. They all had these little, tiny little red dictionaries, you see, and with words. And he tried to learn English or teach me a German word and things like that. And so, you know, you had those, but you know, we knew it was still the enemy. It was still the enemy. And the thing was, we were going to win the war. There was no doubt in our minds we were going to win the war, you know. And And I remember one day after school running down to Howard Davis Park, and we all lined up in front of the King. And we knew the German officers had come across from the Ritz Hotel for their afternoon stroll in the looking for girls or whatever it was, but they'd come and sort of arrogantly stroll through the park. So we'd wait for them, and then we'd line up in front of the King, and then we'd stand to attention, and then which would sort of get their attention, and then we'd all turn and we'd salute the King and then run, and yeah, so.
Were you old enough at school, the decree the Germans put in place to all people should learn German?
Oh yeah. Up at college, we didn't have to at prep, and but up at college, And I remember Wolf. He when he was searching the house. I mean, this guy was a real. I mean, he was a cobra, if ever. Talked like this, very, your daddy got a radio? No? What do you do at school? He said, do you speak any German? I said, yes. Scheiße. I said,